This is Nightly Business Report with Tyler Matheson and Susie Gehring.
Spike and slide. Apple unveils new phones, a mobile payments system, a watch, and the stock twitches word by word. Did the company prove it's still on the cutting edge of innovation?
Safe to swipe? Could the latest data breach at Home Depot be more serious than Target's? A security expert explains if this is just the tip of the iceberg.
And watch your language. The odds are increasing that the Federal Reserve may make an important change to its policy statement as soon as next week. All that and more tonight on Nightly Business Report for Tuesday, September 9th.
Good evening, everyone. A big day for Apple fans and investors and what the company called the next chapter in its history. In a launch with lots of hype and hoopla from Cupertino, California, Apple CEO Tim Cook unveiled 2 new iPhones, a wearable smartwatch, its first all-new device in 4 years, and a payment system that turns the iPhone into a virtual wallet. And while technology geeks cheered with each new device or service announcement, Wall Street investors sent Apple shares on a wild ride, trying to figure out what each product means for Apple's bottom line. After rising more than 3% when the iPhone 6 was unveiled, Apple shares wavered. And at the end of the session, they closed down by nearly 0.5%. A lot of other stocks moved lower today, illustrating the reach of Apple's dominance in devices and services. eBay, the owner of PayPal, down nearly 3%, along with communication systems Sonos. Watch and wearable device makers like Garmin, Movada, and Fossil Group also all headed lower. And GT Advanced Tech, this is the maker of sapphire glass, which may not be used in the new iPhone 6, tumbling 13%. Josh Lipton has more on Apple's big device announcements.
Crowds lined up for Apple's mystery event days ago in New York City and early this morning in Cupertino, California, all to see what Apple's CEO Tim Cook would reveal.
Today, we have some amazing products to share with you. And we think, at the end of the day, that you will agree that this, too, is a very key day for Apple.
And they got it all. A new and improved iPhone. This new version is thinner, has a longer battery life, and will be supported by more carriers. It'll be available on September 19th, $199 for the iPhone 6 and $299 for the larger iPhone 6 Plus. Cook introduced a new mobile payment system as well called Apple Pay, which turns your iPhone into a one-touch payment system. And finally, the much-anticipated Apple Watch. The company's first wearable features dozens of apps to manage time, health, and weather on a thin screen with personalized bands. It's slated to be available early next year for $349.
It's much about personal technology as it is style and taste.
The nearly 2-hour presentation was capped off with an appearance by U2, where the band offered their new release free to iTunes customers through mid-October. The crowds weren't disappointed.
I thought it was kind of neat that, Tim is maybe ushering in a new era where they're highlighting a lot of the other technical talent that works at Apple and giving them a chance to present. I thought that was cool.
But analysts do have concerns because Apple's new watch requires the user to also have an iPhone.
Really, we saw the fall off just as Apple, I think, started to talk about the iWatch and people were getting really excited. And then guess what? You need the iPhone to use the iWatch, and more details to come. That limits the market opportunity, at least over the near term, we think.
Today's event was critical for investors as it was Tim Cook's first big launch since becoming CEO in 2011. The focus will now turn to those new products as customers and developers eagerly await their release. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Josh Lipton.
So what will the new products and a refashioned iPhone mean for the world's most valuable company and its shareholders, including scores of mutual funds you may own? Let's find out from David Garrity. He's principal at GVA Research, and Channing Smith, co-portfolio manager at Capital Advisors. Welcome to both of you. David, was today's event a single, a double, a triple, a home run, or a strikeout? What do you think?
I think the event today was a very good triple to the extent that we've actually got the large factor phone coming out that basically puts Apple in a category that's been showing faster growth. They may not have been innovating in this respect because they were following Samsung, but the thing is now they're competitive, and the product will be out in size in stores before the year-end holiday shopping season. So it's going to drive earnings estimates near term in terms of those will be going up. Relative to the other announcements on Apple Pay, this may be a service that doesn't necessarily drive the bottom line in a very large way, but it will drive consumer loyalty from the standpoint that we think that it's going to bring more consumers basically doing more off Apple's platform, and at the same time it will give Apple access to consumer data streams that they'll be able to monetize. Where we were disappointed, we would have thought to have perhaps heard more about their partnership with IBM that was announced over the summer. IBM, understand, has very strong capabilities in data analytics, given their Watson program. We think also that IBM has very strong security capabilities, something that Apple investors might be concerned about given the recent breaches in their iCloud offering.
So, David, you laid out a lot of the issues that we want to discuss, but I want to bring Channing into the conversation. Channing, you own Apple in your portfolio. How did you feel about the announcements today? Which one of these was a game changer, if at all?
Well, I think what we're focused on is the iPhone. That's the true driver of revenue and earnings growth going forward. We were very pleased to see, the enhancements. The larger form factor is going to be enormous. We think this will be the biggest upgrade cycle we've ever seen. If you look at about 300 to 400 million units that are out there, probably half of those are 2 years old, so you're going to see an enormous upgrade cycle. We're also very happy to see the carriers that are out there have become a lot more flexible with their plans. So we think this is going to be an enormous cycle. We think the new iPhone is good enough. You see the different, the Apple Pay, you see the watch. We're not very excited about that. We don't think that those really drive. Well, I don't think they're a big revenue driver. I mean, if you think about the last two big category killers, and that would be the iPhone, that changed the way we communicated. If you think about the iPad, it's the way we absorb content. It changed the way we absorb content. When I look at the iWatch, I say, well, is that going to change the way I tell time? I also think, and it was mentioned in the segment earlier, that you have to have the iPhone. That's going to create a big headwind for a lot of people that's spending a lot of money on Apple products. And I don't really know if the functionality is there. You have an iPhone in your pocket, it does a lot of the functionality that would be done on your watch.
Very quickly, Channing, I note that you had been selling Apple shares basically for portfolio reasons recently. Did you become a buyer today?
No, we really didn't. We love Apple, and we had a 5.5% position. We cut that down to 3%. The stock's up 25%. We felt that a lot of this good news has already been priced into the stock. What you have today, and I'm feeling it, Apple fatigue. I think the market's going to feel a lot of Apple fatigue. But it's more of a, what's priced in. We think all this is priced in. And now you get to a point where everybody knows what's out there. Now Apple has to execute. And remember, 2 years ago, they had a lot of manufacturing problems and a lot of execution problems. So now at this point, I think they're going to have an excellent Christmas holiday. We think they'll sell 60 million phones through the end of the year. But now they have to execute, and that could be an issue. The iWatch is, we're not going to hear about that really until next year. But we just don't really have a lot of high revenue expectations.
All right, let me ask David about the stock. You have a $125 target on the stock today. It's around $97. You heard what Channing said. I mean, what's the motivation to own this stock?
Well, traders will basically follow near-term earnings estimates, and to the extent that we're going to have a very strong holiday shopping season, I would argue that earnings estimates going up into those numbers will probably serve to support the stock on a relative basis. Obviously, in terms of the broader markets, there are lots of concerns about the Fed. There are lots of concerns about Europe and other economies overseas. But the fact of the matter is that the U.S. market still is the best house in a bad neighborhood. And in this bad neighborhood, Apple is probably going to be one of the better performing names from an earnings momentum perspective. So I would argue from that standpoint, I think $125 a share, 6 to 12 months out, is not out of the question, because I also think at the same time that a lot of the potential in terms of data monetization that we've talked about earlier around Apple Pay will only become more apparent over time. And you'll probably find that the margins on those revenues will be higher than what they're actually making on the hardware itself. So in this respect, you have a business model that's making a transition towards a higher margin model, which at the end of the day also serves to be supportive of stocks.
That helps a lot. If you got a little revenue growth and you increase your margins, it usually ends up meaning better profits and maybe a higher stock price. David, thank you very much. David Garrity, GVA Research, and Channing Smith with Capital Advisors.
On Wall Street today, cautious trading sent stocks falling on disappointing news about sinking sales at McDonald's last month and a security breach at Home Depot. Also impacting the markets, renewed worries about when the Federal Reserve might raise interest rates. By the close, the Dow was down 97 points, the Nasdaq lost 40, and the S&P fell by 13 points.
Well, as Susie just mentioned, August was another tough month at McDonald's. Global sales fell nearly 4%. Overall, at the world's biggest burger chain, its fifth month in a row of declining same-store sales. Investors lost their taste for the company today, sending shares down 1.5%. The chain got slammed by a food safety scare over in China and in Japan. Sales there fell by a steeper than expected 14.5% as it battles tougher competition and also changing tastes here in the United States. Well, markets in the U.S. were not exactly cheered today when Steve Leisman of NBR and its producer CNBC reported that the Federal Reserve may change its policy statement language in a significant way at its meeting next week. Leisman says the odds have gone up that the Fed will drop the phrase considerable time to describe the lag between the end of the Fed's bond-buying stimulus program and when it might raise interest rates. Considerable time was usually interpreted to mean at least 6 months. And if that language goes, Leisman says the market is likely to read that as opening the door to an earlier start to rate hikes.
Among the hardest hit sectors in the markets today, banks, shares of all of the big banks ending lower. This comes on the Federal Reserve and the Senate Banking Committee consider tough new rules to shore up the financial system in the event of another economic downturn. Hampton Pearson takes a look at what the nation's biggest banks could be facing.
Concerns that 6 years after the financial crisis, some American megabanks remain too big to fail now has the Federal Reserve targeting those firms with costly new regulations. At the top of the list, capital surcharges, much higher than what nearly 30 global banks, including 8 U.S. firms, are now paying based on rules adopted by the international regulators in Basel, Switzerland a few years ago. Federal Reserve Governor Daniel Tarullo outlined the Fed's plans for the Senate Banking Committee.
By increasing above Basel III levels the amount of common equity required to be held by these firms, we look to improve their resiliency to take account of the impact their failure would have on the financial system.
Another Fed proposal potentially penalizing big banks' use of short-term funding, including overnight loans, could impact broker-dealer operations at the likes of Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. The Fed governor told lawmakers regulators want to avoid the kind of short-term funding collapse that led to the demise of Lehman Brothers in 2008.
The surcharge formula will directly take into account each U.S. G-SIB's reliance on short-term wholesale funding, which we believe to be a very important indicator of systemic importance because of the potential for funding runs and contagion under stress.
Since the financial crisis, U.S. banks have increased capital by nearly $30 billion to cushion the shock from a future meltdown. The financial services industry is concerned this latest proposal from the Fed could put major U.S. banks at a competitive disadvantage.
The Basel process is designed to make it possible for all of the banks across the world to be working off of one set of standards. And when you change the standards for U.S. banks, necessarily that means that they have a higher standard that they have to stand up to than their foreign competitors.
Today, here on Capitol Hill, we got a preview of what to expect once the Federal Reserve makes a formal rule proposal incorporating those new capital banking surcharges. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Hampton Pearson in Washington.
And also in Washington, an update on the future of the federally run Export-Import Bank, which helps finance foreign purchases of U.S.-made goods exports, after threats to end funding for the bank from the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee. House Speaker John Boehner said the House will instead extend the bank's authority.
Working with Chairman Hensarling, he thinks that a temporary extension of the Export-Import Bank is in order. Whether it's a separate issue or it's in the CR, yet to be decided.
That CR, or continuing resolution bill, is needed to prevent a government shutdown at the end of the month.
Still ahead on the program, could Home Depot's data breach be the biggest yet? We'll hear from a security expert next. Good news if you're looking for a job. The number of advertised job openings in July, more than 4.5 million, marking a 13-year high. The Labor Department's so-called JOLTS survey showed companies stepped up their hiring in July at the fastest pace in nearly 7 years. But the report also showed a sharp drop in government job postings.
A mixed outlook from small business owners. The latest survey from the National Federation of Independent Business shows that small business owner optimism edged a little bit higher in August. More owners expect business conditions to improve in the coming months, and they plan to increase capital spending. But fewer owners say they plan on hiring more workers in the near future.
Salesforce.com, the cloud computing giant, said that a program designed to steal users' login credentials may have targeted some of its software users and could lead to the theft of user login credentials. Salesforce says the malware, known as DiResa, infiltrated systems last week and is the same kind of software that usually targets large financial firms.
Well, as we told you last night, Home Depot finally confirmed that it was the victim of a massive credit card data breach and that the hacking may have happened as early as last April, threatening millions of customers and rivaling, if not exceeding, last year's cyber attack on Target. Shoppers, today we learned that the attorneys general of Connecticut, Illinois, California, they're going to take the lead in a multi-state probe into the attack. New York and Iowa officials will also participate in the investigation.
Well, Home Depot is the latest victim of recent big data breaches. So why does this keep happening, and is the problem fixable? Joining us now, Alan Brill. He's Senior Managing Director of Cybersecurity at Kroll, the risk advisory firm. Alan, nice to have you with us. Every day there's a new headline. So Home Depot, Target, Apple to some extent. Why does this keep happening?
You're right. It's very much the victim of the day. And it keeps happening because ultimately we're not taking steps to make it stop happening. Very simply, look at what's happening. This is not a case in which somebody breaks into a computer and an hour later they find out and they start to fix it. These are cases in which the break-in and the theft of data has lasted for days or weeks, or in the latest case, apparently, since April. That's a long time to have malware running in your system and not notice it. So what we need to do is to get the motivation, whether it's from the board or senior management, to get folks to get the help if they need it, to look at their systems and find out what's really running on their POS systems.
How can it be that you wouldn't notice something like this for 4 or 5 months?
You have to understand that the folks that write the malware are very good at this.
And who are they? Where are they?
They are in Eastern Europe. They are in Asia. They are all over. This is big business. This is not a kid who has nothing better to do in their basement.
Organized crime.
Organized crime with a digital outlook. And like everything else, they keep making their product better, more stealthy, harder to find, memory resident, so that when you look on the disk, you don't actually see anything.
You know, you heard our story in our coverage about what Apple is announcing, this Apple Pay mobile payment system. A lot of companies are trying to do something with this. Is this going to be the new way around all of this? You know, you don't use a credit card. You don't have that magnetic strip that you swipe and that can be hacked into. What do you think is going to happen?
I think that what we're seeing with Apple Pay is the start of perhaps a new paradigm in the way that we pay for things. Remember, Apple didn't just come up with this by themselves. They are dealing with some of the largest banks in the country and in the world, some of the largest retailers with the card brands, so that you now will have a way to pay for something at a point of sale where you're not exposing your actual credit card number, but rather a credential that can be turned into your account, but very securely. And
is it safe?
You know, we're going to have to wait until the specific system is tested.
That's a careful answer.
It's the right answer, but I think it's really something that's on the right track. I don't think that the brands and the banks and the retailers would be working together if they didn't have some indication that this was being done right. It will be tested because you know that some of the first people online, after the people who've been there for a week to buy this new stuff, are going to be the hackers. They're going to take it to understand the software, to reverse engineer the software.
Very quickly, All of these big companies, whether it's Home Depot or Target, they must invest millions in their own computer security. But it hasn't worked.
Yes.
Are there companies, security companies out there that do it better than others?
There are companies that look at things a little differently. For example, one of the things that we've learned in looking at hundreds and hundreds of breaches is that ultimately you have to figure out what it is that went wrong, where that bad software is. Mm-hmm. And if you have the tools that can go into a network, lock on to computers and tell you what's actually running, you can differentiate between those machines that have malware and those that don't, and you can stop it.
You make it sound very easy, but I know it's a lot more complicated than that. Thank you so much, Alan, for coming by. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Alan Brill with Kroll. Barnes & Noble lost less money than expected in its first quarter, and that's where we begin tonight's market focus. Promotions and new products drove up traffic at the bookseller, but sales still declined at Barnes & Noble, with revenue coming in below expectations. Despite that, investors were pleased with the better-than-expected performance, and shares rose about 3% to $24.09. Burlington Stores also reported a loss that was much less than expected. The off-price clothing retailer posted revenue that topped estimates, and it upped its outlook for the year as its sales continue to rise. That pushed shares up 3% to $37.18. American Airlines said its traffic was flat in August compared to a year ago, and its load factor, or the percentage of seats it filled, also fell. Shares slipped to $37.96.
Sony, Disney, DreamWorks, all being accused in a federal lawsuit of conspiring to suppress wages in special effects and animation businesses. The suit alleges the companies agreed not to poach employees from one another and outbid pay offers. The three companies down today, with DreamWorks falling the most. It was off 3.5%. Royal Caribbean upped its quarterly dividend. The new payout is 30 cents a share, up from 25 cents. That's going to be payable to shareholders in October. Despite the news, shares fell a fraction to 66.07.
And more bad news for Atlantic City. The struggling gambling mecca will likely see a fifth casino shut down this year. Trump Entertainment Resorts filed for bankruptcy protection today, saying it had liabilities of more than $100 million. The firm runs two casinos in Atlantic City. The Trump Plaza is already slated to close down next week. The other is the Trump Taj Mahal, which the company says is now expected to close in November. Donald Trump founded but no longer controls Trump Entertainment.
Coming up, what a father is doing to find a treatment for his son's rare disease. The traditional drug companies sometimes won't. Americans are saving more than ever for college, but the amounts people are putting away isn't nearly enough, not even enough to cover 1 year at a public university. Thanks to the rising value of stocks, the College Savings Plan Network reports that the average $529 college plan is now worth just over $20,000, double what it was back in 2008, but not enough to cover even a year's tuition at a big four-year school.
And finally tonight, rare diseases affect very few patients, and often that means treatments come with too great a cost and too small a payoff for big pharmaceutical companies. That's why one former banker quit his job, started his own biotech firm, and launched a campaign to raise millions of dollars after his son was diagnosed with a rare muscular disorder. Meg Terrell has our story.
Ilan Ganot never planned a career in drug development. But 2 years ago, Ilan and his wife, Annie, got the news that changed their lives.
Even just looking at Wikipedia, you see that, wheelchair by 10, 11, 12, and that most of the boys, don't make it past their early 20s. And it was devastating. I mean, words can't describe, as a parent, how you feel.
Their son, Eitani, was diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, a rare genetic disease. There are no treatments for the form Eitani has. Ilan decided to change that. He left his job working with hedge funds at JP Morgan, moved his family to Boston from London, and raised $17 million. With 2 partners, he's founded Solid Ventures, a for-profit company to develop drugs for his son's disease.
Certainly in rare diseases, and there are thousands of them, we find it difficult sometimes to substantiate the economic value, to justify for big companies to roll up sleeves and jump right in.
That's where Solid's focus is, to advance therapies that may be trapped in what the drug industry knows as the Valley of Death, a point where potentially promising medicines get stuck due to lack of funding and resources.
What we're left with is a lot of patients that are left without drugs and a lot of science that is not getting developed. We feel like in Duchenne, it's part of our responsibility to marry the two, and that's what Solid is all about.
Time is precious. Eitani is an energetic 4-year-old now. But over time, his disease will worsen. Ilan and Annie are convinced they'll make a difference.
We're aggressive. We raised enough money to do what we need to do. We have the right people, and very soon we'll have the right treatments too.
Ilan's company, Solid Ventures, has just signed its first deals, including a collaboration with drug giant Pfizer and efforts in gene therapy. It's another example of the measures parents take under extreme circumstances to help their kids. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Meg Terrell.
And that is Nightly Business Report for tonight. I'm Susie Garrow. Thanks for watching.
And I'm Tyler Mathisen. Have a great evening, everybody. We'll hope to see you right back here tomorrow night.
I'm Susie Garrow with a Nightly Business Report news brief. Big news from Apple today, unveiling 2 new phones, both with larger screens, along with its first ever wearable smartwatch device and a new mobile payment system that makes your smartphone into a virtual wallet. But shares of Apple ended lower. On Wall Street, stocks were dragged lower on renewed worries about when the Federal Reserve may raise interest rates, along with disappointing August sales at McDonald's and concerns about that massive credit card security breach at Home Depot stores. At the close, the Dow lost 97 points, the Nasdaq lower by 40, the S&P fell by 13 points. And another Atlantic City, New Jersey casino, the Trump Taj Mahal, is slated to shut down in November. This is the 5th one this year. Be sure to tune into Nightly Business Report right here on your public television station.